On Contact with Chris Hedges. Welcome to On Contact. I'm Chris Hedges. Today we sit down with prison activists Boris Franklin and Walter Fortson.
Once the night falls, again, you know that you survived another day. And usually that's what prison is about, surviving another day.
Trying to get back into functioning like a free person is your first task. And then after that, you have to find opportunity because you're dealing with the brand. You're branded a felon.
On Contact, neoliberalism, patriotism. Truth is not socialist obedience, counterweight, class war, corporate coup d'etat, utopian ideology of neoliberalism, revolt unmasked. On Contact with Chris Hedges. Poor people, especially those of color, are worth nothing to corporations and private contractors on the streets of deindustrialized cities. In jails and prisons, however, their bodies generate revenues of between $40,000 and $50,000 a year. Slavery may have been outlawed in 1865, but within prisons, it remains legal under the 13th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. Prisoners often work inside jails and prisons for nothing or earn about 22 cents an hour. 1 million U.S. prisoners labor inside prisons for for-profit corporations. Over 94% of those behind bars were forced to plea out and never had a trial. Draconian drug laws send non-violent offenders to jail for staggering periods of time, and many, because they witnessed crimes but did not report them, are in prison for felonies they did not actually commit. Prolonged solitary confinement keeps prisoners broken and compliant, methods that international human rights organizations have defined as torture. In poor communities where there are few jobs, little or no vocational training, a dearth of educational opportunities, and a lack of support structures, there are, by design, high rates of recidivism, the engine of the prison industrial complex. Prisons in America are a good business. Let's look at the size and scope of the prison industrial complex in the United States with Anya Parampil.
The prison industry in the United States has become just that, an industry, a fully functional, money-making arm of the free market economy. A 2015 report by the research-based group In the Public's Interest analyzed 60 private prison contracts. It found 65% of them included so-called bed guarantee or lock-up quota deals with the state. In other words, the state promised to fill a certain number of beds regardless of the crime rate. On the lower end, in one California prison, the state promised to fill 70% of the beds. That quota went up to 100% in as many as 3 Arizona prisons, and on average, states promised to fill 90% of beds in the prisons. The quota agreements mean the state must pay a taxpayer-funded fee for empty beds, which directly incentivizes locking more people up. And those taxpayer funds have served the industry well, as it rakes in about $3 billion every year. Some of the biggest winners are the Correction Corporation of America, Geo Group, and the Management Training Corporation. These companies spend millions of dollars lobbying Congress every year for provisions like bed quotas, but also policies which will send more people to jail, like increased sentencing laws and criminalizing more activity. And the more people behind bars, the more money these companies make. As according to the Prison Bureau, the federal government spends $32,000 a year just to house one inmate. Since 1994, the percentage of prisoners held in private facilities has been steadily rising. And as long as that profit incentive remains, it's difficult to foresee a drastic change in the near future.
The prison industrial complex is the civil rights issue of our time. And today I'm joined by 2 outspoken critics of the system of mass incarceration. Boris Franklin, who served 11 years in a maximum security prison, is now a second-year student at Rutgers University. He is joined by Walter Fortson, who spent 2 years in prison, got his degree with honors from Rutgers, and did his graduate work at the University of Cambridge in the UK. They are 2 of the very few who have made it out. Many of those they know, including close relatives, are behind bars or lost on the streets of our violent internal colonies. Thank you for joining me. Let's begin with you, Walter the way people in marginal communities are conditioned almost from birth to enter the prison system, what's known as the kind of school to prison pipeline.
Yeah, it's very troubling when you consider kind of the structural conditions that people of color in particular have to grow up in, raise their families in, and ultimately deal with a system that finds more value in them going to prison than they do being, free, self-sufficient, tax-paying individuals. We find that, in some of our schools in urban areas, we deal with issues of overcrowding. We deal with issues of the resource officers, the metal detectors, just the entire environment creating a carceral space that often conditions people to kind of just the institution of prison and kind of just the characteristics of what prison is. And oftentimes, so when you find yourself going to prison, whether it be from a juvenile to a juvenile justice facility or after you're of age going to an adult facility, there's often no palpable difference or no aesthetic difference than what they've always been in, whether it be a high-rise housing complex to their local school to a prison. There's often no structural difference.
I know, Boris, you talk about that inability to learn because that fight or flight mechanism begins even at home, and by the time you get to school, you're just in no condition, emotionally, psychologically.
Absolutely, you're not in a learning state. Most of these communities where you're going to find a high level of violence because of the drug abuse or what have you, by the time you take that walk to school, you're going to encounter maybe police arresting someone, a man and a woman maybe into a full-blown fist fight. You might see a robbery, and I'm drawing from memory things that I've seen just on my way to school. By the time you get to school, then the outside of the school, what I encountered mostly was in the morning with fist fights. Everyone was fighting. If you
how old were you?
I had to be in the 2nd grade, so you were looking at about 7, 8 years old. You're just looking at an entire community from the time it wakes up is fighting. When I got to school, you would see guys on the front porch throwing fists, on the side of the building throwing fists. And this is a carryover from whatever happened yesterday or happened later on or that night or whatever happened in that community. So by the time you get to class, your fight or flight has been activated. You're dealing with so much anxiety that you have to be settled before you can even start to begin to learn anything. I mean, and this was significant for me because I came from a much calmer community.
Right, you had been in Piscataway, and then your family had moved to, and the Piscataway school system was largely white. So
absolutely,
you had actually, and you had excelled in school and loved school.
Absolutely.
And you got back in the school and they put you in the back of the class and told you to wait until the other kids caught up, and as you say, they kind of never caught up.
No, they never caught up. No.
What is it that, that day when you first walk into prison, and I know, Boris, we'll start with you, you said you got into the mess hall, you went through the metal detectors, you saw the guards, and there was this complete continuity from life outside, that being in prison was not in many ways a culture shock.
Absolutely, it was not a culture shock. If you have been to any of the urban schools, it was sort of set up like prisons. And even the designated areas where the fist fights were at. In a prison, everyone knows that you don't fight in the school areas. So, where the classroom areas are. That usually happens outside of school, what we would call the yard in prison, what you would call a playground. Or in the lunchroom. It's a big
mess hall.
What we would call a mess hall.
Which was one of the most dangerous places in a prison.
Absolutely, and it was the most dangerous places inside of the school. So this thing was just a carryover from school to prison, and it wasn't a culture shock. And this is why some individuals.
But the other thing, I think that get your comment on this, Walter, that many people don't understand that when you get into one of these dysfunctional school systems, really what they're teaching you is enough rote learning and basic literacy to work on the bottom scale of the economy, behind the counter of a fast food, stocking. That's really all you're really, and we're talking about people who graduate from high school.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, it's really interesting when I think about the school system and the way it's set up. I've gone from kindergarten to a master's degree, and I've never taken one class in finance. I've never been taught how to prepare my taxes. I've never been taught the value of a credit score. In that institution, I've found all that information out after graduating and learning that these things were important. How to vote, what Congress is and how that's different from the executive branch of government. So some of those things, again, those are more social science classes.
So there's no even civic education.
Exactly. I mean, you're really not taught how to survive. And nowadays, what you find, most of my colleagues and friends who are teachers talk about some of the major differences. Like, for example, I have several friends in Teach for America who are recruited and teach in some of the urban environments, and they're just appalled by what goes for passing in these schools, and the fact that, and if you're in Atlanta, in one of the urban districts in Atlanta, what goes for an A there would be a C, right, in a general school. It's just things like that are really kind of overwhelming when you consider the fact that there are private prison companies out there who are preying on these people to go to prison and actually projecting, based off of 3rd and 4th grade reading and writing levels, how many beds they're going to need for the future. And so when you're faced with these, just stark realities, it's incumbent upon us to figure out a way we can throw a wrench into the gear and stop the machine that's fueling mass incarceration.
Well, the problem is, and I think you talk a little bit about this, I've heard you speak about it, Boris, it's just the instability is not just on the streets, not just in the schools, but with the disintegration of families themselves, within the house itself, within the home.
Absolutely, right from the very start. The welfare system you could start with, whereas in order to get any sort of assistance, you have to offer up the man.
Right.
The first thing they want is the father's name of the child, because it's called assistance, but actually somebody's going to have to pay this money back. So whatever, I had children who were on the welfare system, and then I was put on child support. So whatever they were receiving, essentially I was going to have to pay this back. And this starts the warrant. You miss a payment, then you have a warrant, and then you're locked up. So if you have a job, you have to take off work, you have to go to court. I mean, I've been through all of these things. And once
we're gonna hold it right there, Boris. We'll hear more from Boris Franklin and Walter Fortson when we come back.
You're watching an RT America special report.
Man, it ain't about him, it's about you, it's about me, it's about everybody.
Basically, everything that you think you know about civil society had broken down.
There's always going to be somebody else one step ahead of the game.
We should not be in the business of normalizing violence.
We don't need people that think like this on our planet.
This is an incredibly tense situation.
They're the war hawks selling you on the idea that dropping bombs brings peace, to the chicken hawks forcing you to fight in the battles that they start.
The news hawks try to tell you that celebrity gossip and tabloid murder trials are the most important news of the day.
While the hawks of advertising tell you that you are not cool enough unless you buy their product.
Watching the hawks, watching the hawks.
These are the hawks that we, along with our audience, will be watching.
On Contact with Chris Hedges. Welcome back to On Contact. We continue our conversation on the prison industrial complex with Boris Franklin and Walter Fortson. Boris, I just want to, before we talk about the reality inside prison, just talk about the instability in the home environment, because you're raising children that have no capacity to develop and grow. And you often talk about how, we essentially create childlike adults out of these environments.
Yeah, well, that's the thing that happens. I mean, once the parents become, you know, unable to take care of the children inherit some sort of a new economic system, which is like selling drugs, and they have buying power now. So they essentially begin to think that they're adults. But this happens because after the welfare system comes in and they offer up the father, you know, for this welfare, and he's not allowed to be an active participant in the family.
When we say offer up the father, we should make it clear that, for instance, you can't get public housing if you have a felony conviction, which, you know, many people do, even if they've pled out and have never gone to prison. So essentially, there are all sorts of mechanisms by which the men are erased from the life of the family, often in physical terms, by putting them behind bars.
Absolutely.
But even without a criminal conviction, the father typically can't be in the house, or the woman won't qualify for public assistance.
Even if they don't have a felony.
Even if they don't.
Right.
So it takes the father out of the household, which he's not an active participant. Then you're raising a child. By the time he gets to that adolescent point, the identity versus role confusion, he does not know his role because he has not seen his father play that role within the house.
All right, so you both walk into prison. And I, you know, have taught in a prison. Boris was one of my students in a maximum security prison in Rahway, so I have some familiarity with that environment. It is a deeply traumatic experience. You were in for 11 years, 2 is more than enough. But talk a little bit about what, now you already have people who are already coping with trauma, coping with stress, coping with, let's say, retarded forms of development through no fault of their own emotional development. And how does prison exacerbate that?
Well, first you come from what I call an environment that arrests the development. And what I always say, when it keeps you essentially juvenile, then you'll essentially or eventually arrest the bodies. Now, when you go into prison, you become a dependent again. All of these things are handed to you, your meals are handed to you, and then you have minimum movement, so your autonomy begins to diminish as well. So once you're in the prison, and then there's the harassment environment, there's the sound of sirens going off.
Yeah, it's very noisy. That's what a lot of people don't know, until finally lights are out. But
until lights are out. And this is when people calm down. You can feel the relief of the pressure because you know you've survived another day in prison. When you wake up in the morning, you're not sure if you're going to survive that day by an assault from a prisoner or an assault from a guard.
And I think we should talk about solitary. I don't know if you were in solitary. I know Boris was not long, but long enough. Solitary, which unfortunately is punitive. We have 45,000 prisoners in this country of our 2.3 million prisoners right now at this moment in solitary. And you spend 6 days in solitary, is that right, Boris?
Well, I spent 6 days in solitary during one of my first youthful incarcerations. However, during the time I was in the county jail, I never even thought about it as solitary, but the jail was locked down.
Well, you talk about just losing all sense of time. I mean, it's very disorienting. It psychologically breaks you down. Groups like Amnesty International consider it a form of torture. I don't know if you were in solitary, Walter.
No, I wasn't in solitary. I have several colleagues and friends who are in solitary confinement, and it's just always been conveyed to me as, you know, an experience where you lose your mind because there are no windows, there's no real other human contact unless someone is in there, and you start to hear voices, you start to go crazy. Your mind starts to make up for the lack of sensory stimuli that you would face otherwise in the regular world.
I mean, you talked even with the limited time you were in of being completely disoriented.
Well, you can tell what time the meals are coming by which way the shadow is forming on the wall. And the thing is that when you're in there, if you don't learn how to structure your time while you're in there, first of all, you have no concept of time, so this is a very hard thing to do. But to structure your time, you know, you can work out, you can try to do something to get through that day. And once the night falls, again, you know that you survived another day. And usually that's what prison is about, surviving another day.
One of the tragedies of the 1994 Omnibus Crime Bill passed by Bill Clinton, who is responsible for almost doubling our prison population from that bill, and the 3 strikes you're out laws, but also increasing the lengths of sentences, is that he, and a lot of people don't know, he eradicated prison education programs.
Right.
So you have prisons, I've taught in the Supermax prison in Trenton, these people have nothing. They don't even get rec time. You know, in Rahway, where Boris was, people could get out in the yard, lift weights. There was some kind of movement. These people don't even move. And so you have people oftentimes serving incredibly long sentences, triple, quadruple what for similar crimes, anyone would be serving in Europe, and they have nothing. So talk a little bit about the effect of that, the stagnation that happens.
Well, I think that, regardless of supermax or full minimum, when you think about what a prison is in terms of a lockdown, 100% controlled space with that warehouses people, when you have that many people in one space, you're eventually going to develop systems of operation, informal systems of operation that the incarcerated will develop, and then the overarching forms of control that the custody has to develop. And those are how systems go, and those systems have their own checks and balances and can often be brutal. And what I find interesting is that, in the 1950s, most criminologists predicted that by the 1970s we wouldn't have prisons because they failed at such abysmal rates. We have the Stanford prison experiment, yet we doubled down and continue to warehouse people, expecting that upon their release they're suddenly going to be well polished.
But let's stop there, because I think it's much more insidious than that. I think that there is a vested interest now, with especially corporations moving into the prison systems. In the prisons in most states, the food companies are run by large corporations like Aramark. You have the Global Tel-Link running the phone service, JPay for money transfers, and they are, taking it out on in terms of financial gain on the vulnerable. So if you transfer money, you have to pay a service fee. Sure. You're paying phone rates 4 to 5 times higher than you would on the outside, and phones are the primary means by which children are in connection with their incarcerated parents, and they have their lobbyists. And of course, we have the rise of the for-profit prison system. And so if you look on Corrections Corp of America website, they talk about prisons being a good investment because there's 64, 67% recidivism. And people say, well, the system doesn't work. Well, no, the system works just the way it's designed to work. Yeah, it's designed to work that way. And let's talk about what happens now. You get out. Clinton has destroyed these educational programs. People have been psychologically damaged, not only from the trauma and stress of being in prison. You talk about never being able to sleep in prison. And there's been no vocational training. There's been virtually no counseling for people who come out of. And what happens on the outside?
Well, first of all, it's just so tight. The potential for violence in a prison, you just have to be able to feel the pressure that at any given moment, it creates such a situation for an individual to actually lose their mind.
Right.
I mean, there was an individual who had committed a murder in the mess hall, and what you have is 100 people sitting there watching it. There was trauma. There was nothing that came in. No one came in. Nobody talked to these individuals. They literally watch a man kill a man with his bare hands, take his neck, snap him backwards, and break him in half, drag him under a coffee pot, and pour hot coffee.
And we should be clear: the COs, the correction officers, are watching this too.
They don't.
But they won't come into the mess hall because it's too dangerous.
No, they will not come in that mess hall. So when you go to eat, your anxiety level goes up.
Let's talk about getting out. So you come out with this kind of emotional, psychological damage, which has already been severe in your childhood. Now it's been compounded by the prison experience. What happens on the outside and we should make it clear that both Boris and Walter are less than 1%. Most people are not going to the University of Cambridge and are honor students as Boris is at Rutgers. You are, a very tiny minority. What happens to most people?
I think when you come out of prison, the first thing that you have to do is reacclimate yourself to the rules of society and unlearn the rules in the prison. Because if somebody's walking into prison and bumps you and doesn't say excuse me, that can be a big deal, whereas it's just a regular occurrence in a place like New York City. And so unlearning those things and trying to get back into functioning like a free person is your first task. And then after that, you have to find opportunity, because you're dealing with the brand. You're branded a felon.
Let me talk about your brother here, and let's close with this. Because your brother's in Philly, and your brother is struggling.
Yes.
Explain what's happened and how that, all of those barriers that are thrown up, especially in front of an ex-felon, just finally often crush you.
Yeah, my brother has struggled with dealing with the system for the majority of his life, and he's, after completing a 7-year prison sentence, he comes out and it's a cycle. It's a cycle every time. He'll come out and he'll start hitting the ground running. He has a very supportive family who tries to help him. He'll find employment through a temp agency and get some manual labor work. He'll find like a cheap car to get him back and forth to work. But what happens is, trying to again find his way and be able to sustain himself as the young man that he is, he starts dealing with the economic pressures of trying to pay bills and make ends meet and still have some form of a life.
And we should be clear, you're living so close on the edge that the moment the car breaks down, it's catastrophe.
It's a catastrophe. It's a catastrophe. And we've been at that place several times. And so, you know, because of the way it's structured, and he has such a long parole period, that, you know, he has to find ways to deal with it psychologically. And he's also spent quite a bit of time in solitary confinement.
And you know, just to close here, I mean, you just saw him recently, and tell us what that conversation was like.
Well, I saw him recently because since the 7-year sentence, he's been back to prison twice, and he's on his way back again because of drug addiction, and that's the way he medicates. But he looked at me and he just said, he was crying in his face. He said, I don't know what to do. Like, I'm helpless. I'm helpless. I need help. I need a therapist. I can't afford a therapist. Right. I need some help. Prison is not what I need. They don't do anything for me in there. I don't want to go back. I don't want to keep doing drugs. I don't want to go through the cycle, but I don't have anything else. I have nothing else.
And that is the story of so many people in this country who have never had a chance, in essence. Thank you, Walter. Thank you, Boris. Our prison industrial complex, which holds 2.2 million prisoners, or 25% of the world's prison population, makes money by keeping prisons full. It demands bodies, regardless of color, gender, or ethnicity. As the system drains the pool of black and brown bodies, it has begun to incarcerate others. Women, the fastest growing segment of the prison population, are swelling prisons, as are poor whites, Hispanics, and immigrants. Prisons are no longer a black and white issue. Corporations have poured billions into the business of mass incarceration. They have privatized phone services, money transfer services, food services, and commissary services. They expect long-term returns, and they will get them. It is their lobbyists who write the laws that demand absurdly long sentences, deny paroles, determine immigrant detention laws, and impose minimum sentences and 3 strikes you're out laws mandating life sentences after 3 felony convictions. What the corporate state does to the most vulnerable among us, it will seek to do to all of us. Thank you for watching. You can find us on rt.com/oncontact. Until next week.